and management degree at Thunderbird. Thank you, Dr. Cross.
Thanks, Becca. It's great to be with everyone today. Excited to talk a little bit about storytelling for leaders. I wanted to start off I remembered an experience I had about 18 years ago. I was living in Brazil. I was learning Portuguese. I was getting better at Portuguese, but I wasn't that great yet. And I was feeling very alone because, frankly, my friends were all speaking Portuguese to each other, and I couldn't speak Portuguese as well as them. And I was starting to feel kind of embarrassed and left out. And then one day, I remember suddenly something clicked in my mind. And when that thing clicked, I began to make extreme leaps in my language abilities. And for the first time in many, many months, I was able to tell a story, a personal story. And I felt like I had part of myself back. I felt like that I actually could express myself and I had part of my identity back. And it's really no wonder that I felt that way, because in many ways, our personal stories make up our identity. If you think about this, we are the stories that we tell ourselves. And so as I was learning a new language and I wasn't able to express myself, I had lost part of myself because I wasn't able to tell my own story. And so the first thing I want to talk about as far as storytelling for leaders is that the first story we really have to learn how to tell really well is our own stories. So one theorist writes that autobiography is not merely something we read in a book, but rather is a discourse of our own identity delivered bit by bit and the stories we tell about ourselves day in and day out. We really are our stories. And one of the things that distinguishes leaders from just any other individual, at least charismatic leaders or leaders who are effective in organizations, is that leaders are narratives that are strong enough for others to follow. So let's think about that for a minute. What I'm arguing is that not only can leaders tell stories, but they are a strong story. And because they're a strong story, other people want to follow them. In other words, it is really, really important, if you want to be a great leader, not only to know how to tell great stories to illustrate your points, but to tell your own personal story to connect with your audience. Stories also help us form more than just our identity. They help us connect dots in our lives and make meaning. In other words, sometimes there's lots of different things that happen throughout our lives, and we can use a story to connect those dots together. This can be in a personal way, or this can be also through an organizational setting where we're trying to help people understand an initiative or helping them understand a change initiative that's going on or new policies. We can illustrate from points that are very disparate through stories and connect those to help people make meaning. Let me give you an example of how people connect the dots or the disparate events in their lives through story. A number of years ago, Steve Jobs, the former CEO of Apple Computers, was invited to give the commencement speech at Stanford University. Now, one interesting thing about Steve Jobs is that he never graduated from college. And so he starts out his commencement speech saying, "Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation." So first, Jobs is setting up his story by saying, look, I'm a college dropout, but here I am, interestingly, speaking at a graduation for Stanford University. And he continues on, and he's going to tell 3 different stories to illustrate very disparate things that happen in his life, very varied things that may not have any connection at first glance, to create a cohesive storyline for us all to buy into and then want to follow. So the first thing he talks about is dropping out and dropping in. Steve Jobs was adopted by his parents, and his birth mother made his adopted parents promise that they would send him to college. So the adopted parents promised that they would send Steve to college, and indeed they did send Steve to college. And Steve chose to go to Reed College, a liberal arts college. There was only a couple problems. First was that the college was very expensive. And second, once Steve started going to classes, he felt like that maybe he was wasting his time and his parents' money And so he decided to drop out. But after dropping out, Steve explains that he decided to start dropping in to classes that he just found interesting. So he wasn't paying tuition, but he would just show up to classes he thought were interesting, and he would sit in the classes and he would learn what he wanted to learn, and then he'd go on to the next class. One class that he dropped into was a calligraphy class. This is one of those fine writing courses where you learn how to do beautiful typefaces and fonts and all those things. And he really loved that course, and he loved the instructor, and he fell in love with typography. And Steve explains in his commencement address that if he had never dropped out, he would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. So here Steve is making sense of some things that looking forward or in the moment didn't seem to make sense together, but now looking backwards, connecting the dots, make perfect sense. In this case, he dropped out of college, dropped into a calligraphy class, and because he dropped into that calligraphy class, learned something that then affected the way personal computing is now happening today. So thanks to Steve and dropping out and dropping in, we have beautiful typography. One theorist, narrative theorist, says that the construction of these varied images helps to integrate a life by bringing the same narrative format to different personifications. In other words, just like Steve Jobs says, we all are many. We are e pluribus unum. That's the motto of the United States, right? Many into one. We are many and one. We're many selves. We have many aspects of ourselves, many different storylines of ourselves. And Steve Jobs is showing us through his examples how he's integrating those many differences. The second story that Steve tells is how he got fired from Apple. So of course he started Apple with Steve Wozniak. It became very popular in the late 1980s and the 1990s, and then Steve had hired a new CEO to help run the business side of Apple, and some things went wrong, and the next thing you know, the board and the CEO got together and they fired Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, from his own company. And he said he was very embarrassed because it was a public firing. It wasn't anything that he could hide. It was on the front page of newspapers and websites. And so he was kind of disgraced and he left. And he founded a new company later called Pixar. Of course, we know that they made Toy Story. And then later on, Apple eventually picked up and bought Pixar. And Steve came back to be the CEO of Apple. So through this sort of firing, Steve was able to reimagine a new organization and then come back into Apple with new ideas. I'm not going to read you this whole quote here, but this is another narrative theorist who says that in many ways, when we are describing a cohesive storyline of ourselves, we are actually imbuing it with an intention. We are saying, look, it was fortuitous, for example, that I got fired from Apple, but because I was fired from Apple, I started Pixar, and because I started Pixar, we got integrated into Apple, and now Apple is much more innovative than it would have been before, making sense out of things that don't often, on surface level, make sense. The last story that Steve tells is about confronting death. Steve Jobs, as we know, had cancer. He talks about being diagnosed with cancer. He talks about going through treatments, and he talks about beating cancer, and then being able to have a new outlook on life. And he says that because he had that confrontation with the end, he was able to start to reevaluate what was important in his life and what was important in his work. So one example he gives is that every morning after this near-death experience, he would look in the mirror and ask himself, do I love what I'm doing today? And if there were too many days in a row where he said, no, I don't love what I'm doing today, then he would decide that there was something he needed to change, and he would make some changes in his life. And because he would make these changes, he was able to continue to grow in his job and in his career. Now, we know that sadly, Steve did die from cancer, and he passed away, but he left a legacy for us, a story that many of us still follow and believe in through Apple computers. Even the new CEO, Tim Cook, I think, continues the legacy and the thought leadership of Steve Jobs. But Steve, because he had a very, very poignant core narrative, we all believed in that, and we could follow that as followers. Now, not only do these stories of ourselves help us to create an identity and also find ways to motivate others and inspire others, it also can be used as a tool, as I mentioned at the beginning. Leaders can use stories as tools to help them illustrate points. And there's some interesting research of what kind of structures we might use for the different stories that we might tell. So Joseph Campbell was a sociologist and a scholar, and he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And what he noticed in reading and studying many, many different, we would call them myths, but different stories from different cultures, is that there was a similar pattern to all these stories across time and across cultures. And one of these, what he calls a monomyth, one of these large archetypal myths or story structures that he found, he calls the hero's journey. And you can see that on the left-hand side of your screen. What Campbell argues is, let me take you quickly through this circle, this hero's journey, is that generally stories that follow this structure go something like this. There's a character, a protagonist, he or she is living in an ordinary world, sort of a mundane life. Something happens where they are, number two, called to action or to adventure. So something calls them to do something different. Think Frodo and the Lord of the Rings. He's just going about his business, and next thing you know, he's called to adventure. Then in three, there's some refusal of the call. In other words, the protagonist doesn't want to go on the adventure. They like being in their ordinary life, and so they refuse the call. Then they meet a mentor who helps them to have the courage to actually heed the call to adventure. So they meet some sort of mentor. And at this point is number five, we call it crossing the threshold. They're moving from the ordinary world into a new special world, out of their comfort zone psychologically into a new special world. And inside this special world, they will encounter, number six, tests, allies, and enemies. They'll meet friends, they'll go through trials, they'll have battles. And then number seven, they're approaching some climax in their story. And number eight, there's some sort of ordeal, right? Some sort of hard thing they have to deal with, some sort of confrontation with death, some sort of gaining a slaying of a dragon, something like that. And then they get a reward in 9. Once they gain this reward, they're moving back towards a rebirth as a new person into their ordinary world. But when they come back into their ordinary world, if you look in number 12, they say return with the elixir. This means they're bringing back the knowledge, they're bringing back the reward that they have received through their journey back to the people in the ordinary world, and thus become a hero. Now, this is a pretty complicated story structure, has lots of different steps in it, but what I like to do is simplify it on the right-hand side of your screen down to 5 parts, and we'll even simplify it further here in a minute. But really, there's 5 things that happen in these hero journey stories. There's a call to action or to adventure. There's a separation from their old life into a new world. There's a descent, or what I would call an ascent, a climax, a rising action towards some sort of actual ordeal or something like that. And then there's an initiation because they made it through the ordeal, and then a return home or a return to the ordinary world. Now, it wasn't just Campbell who noticed these similarities. If we go back further into some theorists in the 1800s, Gustav Freytag, said, look, there's really only 5 things that you need to know about most stories. There's an exposition, that's the beginning part of a story that gives background, setting, those kinds of things, sort of level sets in the story. Then there's a rising action that is sort of building tensions towards a climax. Something happens, and then a falling action, and then a resolution at the end. So tying up of all those different aspects. Now I'll take you through a couple of examples. Kurt Vonnegut, the famous American writer, he gave a lecture one time, and he kind of said there's really only a couple of different types of stories, and he wrote this graphic, and I'm starting in the top left quadrant of the graphic. And if it's hard to read, I'll tell you what it says. The horizontal axis is beginning of the story and end, and the vertical axis is fortune, good fortune at the top, ill fortune or bad fortune at the bottom. And he's going to give us a couple examples of different types of stories. So the first one is boy meets girl. So you see at the beginning, boy is doing fine, he's in his normal element, and then as the graph peaks up, he meets the girl, he's very ecstatic, he's having a great time, and then he loses the girl, and his fortune goes down to the bottom, and he goes through some trials and tribulations there, and then there's that would be the climax, even though it's the bottom, so that's the climax, and then he gets the girl back, and that's a resolution, and his fortune goes back to the top. That's basically the structure of every rom-com or romantic comedy you've ever watched. It's, someone gets the love of their life, loses it somehow, and then gets it back. At least in American films, we like to sort of make things happy at the end. Then you see in the next one, this is the Cinderella archetype story structure. So Cinderella, she is starting out with ill fortune because she suffered a great loss. She's an orphan, she has a mean stepmother, and stepsisters are mean, and she is sort of down towards the ill fortune and at the beginning of the story, and then she meets a fairy godmother. This harkens back to this idea of meeting a mentor, and step by step she gets a new dress, she gets new shoes, right, and she gets some magic that helps her along the way. And because she has this magic, she's able to go to the ball and meet the prince. That's the sort of high point you see there on the graph. Then the clock chimes 12. Her carriage turns back into a pumpkin. She falls back to the bottom. She loses track of the prince. She loses her slipper. And then she sort of is stuck in a sort of, she knows there's a better life. That's why there's a straight horizontal line, but she's not being able to overcome that until the prince finds her with a slipper and then goes back up again happily ever after. And that's why there's a sort of an infinity mark up there in the right hand corner. Then there's one more I'll explain here in the lower left quadrant, and this is what's called the man in the hole structure. So this is what we would call a redemptive storyline. This is one that is very popular and useful for leaders to use. And that is, here you have someone at the beginning of the story has pretty good fortune, pretty high fortune. And then the next thing you know, something terrible happens to them. They go to the very bottom of ill fortune. And down there, they're struggling for a long while. And then they overcome a lot of things. They get help from friends, and they come out back to the top of the fortune, not on their own, but able to overcome the different things that happen. So that is the man in the hole, and that's a redemptive story. It's somebody who is able to move through trials and tribulations and come out again. Dan McAdams, out of, I think he's at Northwestern, he actually says that this is the storyline that the American people love in particular, a story of kind of going down and then coming up and being redemptive in nature and having that hero's journey. So these are some structures you might use as a leader, as a storyteller, but you do have to have down your own personal story first. I mean, one of the things that people often ask me is, why, Ted, are you so passionate about distance education, about leadership education, about digitally powered education? And, what I really answer is that I had an experience in my life that changed my outlook on digital and online education. Um, I was in Philadelphia. I was at the time, my wife and I were both going to the University of Pennsylvania at night. She was working at the Wharton School, and I was working full time, and we were trying to work and go to school. And then suddenly she fell ill, and she had to quit her job. She had to go on an IV for 3 months at home, and she also couldn't go to night school anymore at the University of Pennsylvania. And my wife really didn't have much hope for continuing her education. Now, let me remind you, this is someone who started out as a Coca-Cola scholar at Yale University, was going to the University of Pennsylvania, another Ivy League, and now is stuck at home, not being able to do the schooling that she wants or work. Then a couple years later, fast forward in the story, she and I were in LA, and I was finishing my doctorate at Pepperdine, and she found Arizona State University online and was able to connect with ASU online and finish her degree that she had started many years before, because there was a flexible format that allowed her to do it on her time and at a distance, right? And at that point is when I really started to believe in the power of distance education to change people's lives, including my wife's and by extension, my own. And so that story sort of orients the way that I approach education, and it helps me to convey to other people who I am as a leader. Now, Paul Zak mentions that stories just aren't important because they connect us to others, but because they physically change us. He tells a story about being in an airplane. He's watching a movie, and he has his earphones in. And Paul Zak, he's from Claremont Graduate University. He's a professor of management and psychology, and he's watching this movie inside the airplane with his earphones in. He's watching $1 Million Baby, if I recall correctly, and he's really engrossed in the movie. And he doesn't notice, but suddenly, after about an hour, his seatmate turns to him and hands him a tissue. And he looks kind of confused at his seatmate, and he takes the tissue and he realizes that he's been sobbing, crying, while he's watching this movie in an airplane with his earphones in, and he hadn't even realized it. And so Paul Zak sets out in his research to explain why do movies make us cry, and why was he so engrossed in this movie to begin with. And what he discovers is what theorists call the narrative transportation theory. And what this means is that if you have ever really been into a TV show, a movie, a book, or any kind of story, what you will notice is that you begin to take on the emotions of the protagonist or other characters in the story. So it's not just that we are reading or watching a story, we become part of the story and we start to feel those emotions. This is why movies make us cry. It's because we are taking on the place of the protagonist and we start to feel those same emotions. Because we feel those same emotions, this story, or any story that engrosses us in this way, is physically affecting us. So it's just not psychological in nature. If you start to cry, that's a physical response. If you feel certain emotions, that's a physical response. And Paul Zak has actually measured other physiological responses when people are involved in a story. And what happens is that it changes the way we behave after that story. Paul Zak actually did an experiment where he showed a story about a father and a son. The son was diagnosed with cancer, and sort of that journey of how they're negotiating that terrible news. And what they found is if they showed this story to people, and then asked them to donate to a cause of children's cancer research, one group that saw that story of the father and the son gave more money than a control group that actually saw a video that had nothing to do with the story of the young son having cancer. And so it actually changes our behaviors and our what Zach calls pro-social behaviors, giving behaviors. So it's important to understand that stories just aren't about painting a picture or communicating well. It's also the fact that if you have a core narrative as a leader that makes a lot of sense, that resonates with people, yes, it will motivate them. If you can tell a great story, that's even better because you can illustrate hard to understand things, but also it can change the people to whom you are telling the story, and it will change you as the storyteller. So Paul Zach mentions that emotional simulation, which is what's happening when you're engrossed in a story, is the foundation for empathy and is particularly powerful for social creatures like humans. There's a bunch of studies going on now that are starting to show that reading good fiction or studying film, for example, can help build empathy. Now, we're still learning about this. There's nothing definitive yet, but we are starting to believe, the researchers especially in this area, that stories can change us. So let me summarize here by saying what I'm arguing is that leaders are narratives, and that they're narratives that are strong enough for others to follow. Further, that leaders gain followers through employing stories to illustrate their vision of a better future. And so my question for you all is, what stories are you telling? Even more important, what stories are you living? And last, what stories will you model? Thank you for spending time with us today. I'd be glad to take a few questions.
Yes, if everyone would please post your questions in the Q&A box. And we have a comment from Larry regarding your Steve Jobs opening.
Yes.
I am sure that the example with dropping out, dropping in for the most part is compelling. However, there is a definite leap in the last step. With 10% of the market share, the typography we have presently in computing has more to do with Adobe than Apple.
That very well may be the case, but Steve Jobs tells a great, compelling story about it, right? And he says that the Apple computers were one of the first to actually care about typefaces at all.
We also have a comment from Soma. Is it Pixar or Next?
It was Next and then Pixar.
Okay, excellent. And we welcome more questions. If you would type those in the box, please. Also, we hope you'll join us next month for Got Grit, Understanding Passion and Persistence for Long-Term Goals, October 18th at 11 a.m. Arizona time.
And while Becca is picking up a few more questions, let me mention here that if you like these kinds of topics, you may be interested in our online Masters of Applied Leadership and Management. We invite you to reach out to us for more information. Becca's available, I'm available. We will send you some email updates on the program, as well as email updates about our different webinars that we have each month.
A question from Marty. Have you seen the movie A Story Worth Living?
No, I haven't.
It gets into the elements of a story and how a person's life is a story, as you described.
Thank you for that comment. I will check out that film. Certainly, I think that our identities are informed by our stories. And what is more important is that we need to be able to retool the stories that we tell ourselves to change our identities. And so there's some interesting work. There's a great book called Redirect, if any of you want to check it out, that talks about a story editing technique to help gain personal change and sort of edit your own storyline so that your personal self-talk isn't influencing you in a negative fashion.
A question from Kamuran. What role does humor and wit play without seeming snobbish?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So lots of, if you read the books on public speaking, or if you read books on storytelling, they'll always say to have some sort of wit or humor in there. There's actually a a professor, Professor Nelson at Arizona State University, who studies humor studies. I took some classes from him, and really, it's tough if you're not a naturally sort of witty and funny person. It can sound kind of forced if you try to put it in. But if you are sort of natural, and also I'll mention that you don't need to start a story or a public speech with a joke every time. That's sort of old hat. People kind of overdo that, I think, in my opinion. So you have to be careful how you use humor. I think that if you are more authentic to your own style, it will come off less snobby.
A question from Colleen. Can you speak more about the narrative transformation theory?
Sure. So narrative transportation theory is basically arguing that the reason why stories are so effective is that it transport a good story. So not all stories, a good story, especially ones that follow that Freytag sort of exposition, rising action, climax, following action, and conclusion. If they follow that kind of attention and sort of a structure, that what they do is they transport us into the story, and they engage our mirror neurons. So all of us in our brains have mirror neurons. These were discovered by some scientists who are actually doing some experimentations with chimpanzees, and they put a sort of brain tracking electrodes on the heads of these chimpanzees, and they noticed that whenever they, as the researchers, were eating a banana outside of the cage, that the monkeys' mirror neurons, the neurons in their brain, would light up, the same ones as if they were also eating that banana. So they were watching their sort of researcher. The monkeys were watching the researcher eat their own banana, but then they said that they noticed on the screen of the electrodes printouts that the monkey's brain was simulating eating a banana too, even though they weren't. And so this is probably why we think that stories can affect us in such a way, is because we often don't know the difference as humans between seeing and being engrossed in a story and experiencing something in reality. So we can have, that's why also I believe dreams are so powerful. So dreams are very powerful because have you ever woken up in the morning and you're wondering, did that really happen, or was that just a dream? There's a little bit of time at the beginning when you wake up where sometimes you wonder that. And that's because your brain has been simulating experiences. And if you can simulate these experiences through story, you can really transport people into that story. And you can convince them of things. You can create empathy. This is why one of the best ways to create tolerance in people is to help them be engrossed in stories that are unlike their own. Also, if they come into contact with people who aren't like themselves, that is very helpful. But all these things go back to the notion of this transportation narrative theory, which is a great story transports you into the story and you begin to experience it yourself.
From Sonia, could you suggest a bibliography on how to model and articulate our story?
Yes, so I can, we'll send along these slides and we'll have a bibliography, a references section that will give you some books and some articles that you might want to read on these different tactics and these different theories.
Okay, that's perfect. Richard also asks that question. And yes, we will send the recording as well as the slides out after. From Oscar, how do you balance the real versus fiction in the stories we share with our teams?
So this is an interesting question. So there's, when can we use fiction in a nonfiction setting, right? When can we use facts or bend the facts to our advantage? And the answer is you need to be ethical and you need to figure out what you're comfortable with. We don't want to deceive people. Let me give you one example. eBay, there's a story about the eBay starting, and that the reason that eBay started was because the guy who started eBay, he had a girlfriend who wanted to sell her Beanie Babies. Remember when everyone collected Beanie Babies and they were supposed to be worth a lot of money? And so the story goes that she wanted to sell Beanie Babies, but there was no place to really sell them in a broad fashion. And so he invented this thing called eBay, an online marketplace, to be able to sell Beanie Babies. Now, if you dig into that origin story of eBay, it's very compelling. There's a lot of questions about whether or not it's actually true, right? Did that actually ever happen? There's some people say yes, some people say no. Now, is the story useful still? Yes. I would err on the side of let's make sure we're pulling things that are true from our own experience to be able to paint a picture, because that builds trust. Now, certainly you're going to want to package your real, true experience in a story format. So you're going to want to have vivid details. You want to package those in a way that paints a picture for people. But this is an ethical line that you as a leader and a storyteller have to negotiate, which is which stories are you going to tell? Which ones are true or true enough to pass muster along your ethical line? I say err on the side of being as true as you can to the stories and finding examples that you have really experienced to illustrate your points.
From Heather, when motivating a sales team, do you think the redemptive story is the best format?
So a sales team obviously needs to have lots and lots of persistence. And so the redemptive storyline can be very helpful, especially if you can tell a redemptive storyline that has multiple downs and ups. So multiple obstacles that someone has encountered and overcome them, and then gone back up in their fortune and gone back down and back up. And sort of, if you can paint that storyline for people, it can help them understand that everyone encounters these types of obstacles and that they might be able to overcome them too. Timothy Wilson argues that if you want people to be more persistent, he's done some experiments with undergraduates who have done poorly on their first midterm test. He found that if he just had those undergraduates who did poorly on their test go and talk with upperclassmen who also had gone through similar experiences but had survived and persisted and not desisted in college, they were more likely to continue on and get a better grade the next time. And so if you can also have models of people in the organization who have overcome obstacles and embody a redemptive storyline, that can be particularly effective.
Antonia asks, when we go through life experience, we are not always enlightened about the reason why. How does regular reflection on our lives help us find usefulness in our stories to help others?
So this is one of the key sort of traditions or tactics of a field of study called narrative psychology. This idea of reflecting and looking backwards, we can make the connections between all these things that don't seem to make sense. So it's very important to employ a reflective habit of some kind, whether that's journaling, whether that's vision boarding, whether that's talking it out with a therapist, a coach, a friend, whatever. But as you take time to stop and reflect, you can make sense of the things that have happened. Looking backwards, you're right, you can't do it looking forwards very quickly, very often. But if you build in as a leader time to reflect, not only on your own personal journey, but also on your organizational journey, you can make sense of things and be ready for strategic pivots as they come up.
From Michelle, do you think it is possible to achieve this simulation through reading a book instead of seeing a visual representation? Is there research being done with books as well?
Yes, so most of the research actually is being done on literature right now. And so we definitely think that this transportation, the narrative transportation theory came out of the literary theorists and then into the psychology realm. But, a good English teacher could tell us that, of course, a good book can transport you into the story. I remember being a senior in high school and reading Crime and Punishment for the first time and being extremely disconcerted because I was starting to have empathy and identify with this character who had done horrible things in the storyline, but was a redemptive sort of character in the story. And that was my first experience of being sucked into a story in a real emotional way and having it start to change my perspective on life. And so this is one of the reasons why liberal arts colleges are starting to make the argument, and why Thunderbird is unique in this way that we teach culture and we teach global studies, is that if you can understand other people's stories, you might be able to understand them better.
From Ernestina, how does vulnerability of a story fit in the whole picture of sharing to build others without compromising yourself to scrutiny?
So this is one thing we have to be careful with. It depends on which culture you find yourself embedded in. There are some cultures that will not tolerate sort of this idea of vulnerability because it might be seen as weakness. Other cultures will view it as authenticity. So here in the United States, for example, we are getting to a point in history, in American history at least, where authenticity is super valued. And because authenticity is valued, it is often to the leader's advantage to reveal some of their own sort of struggles, to humanize themselves, and through humanizing themselves are able to connect with others, because as a leader, sometimes we put ourselves up as a model, and sometimes that is a model that is out of reach, even though we as leaders may know that we have lots of flaws. If we aren't explicit about that, sometimes our followers won't follow because they don't see any vulnerability. So you're right, it is a fine line to sort of negotiate. You have to take into the cultural context first, and second, how much of my own vulnerabilities can I reveal? I tend to err on the side of disclosing more vulnerabilities, and then showing how those can be advantageous to whatever cause I'm proposing, or whatever I'm trying to convince someone to. But it can also build empathy. But it is something that is tough to negotiate, and frankly, there's no good answer. You have to understand the situational context and how you might want to apply it.
From Galaxy, what tips do you give to introverts to become better storytellers?
Yeah, so introverts might not like to stand up in front of a crowd and give tell a story or give a speech, but there's certainly ways, especially in the digital age, where introverts can find ways to tell stories. Is it through writing? Is it through other means, electronic means, that you might be able to tell your story? Are you more comfortable with doing a recording of your story and then putting that online? Also, introverts might be more comfortable in actually telling the story in a small group setting, in a one-on-one setting. Is there a way that you could tell your story to a couple key influencers in the organization, for example, and then they carry on the story, right? Going back to that eBay example, the eBay founder doesn't tell this story often. It's other people. It's become a legend, right? It's become a legend, and it's been propagated throughout the organization because other people have told the story for the founder.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. And we have a comment from Shelley. A comment about storytelling by introverts. I think I worry about taking up too much time talking about myself.
Yep, that can be, all storytelling can often run into the, am I just telling a story about myself? Now, what you have to step back and ask is, why am I telling this story? Am I telling this story to highlight my own personal glories, or am I doing it to help illustrate something bigger than myself? If you can use it to illustrate something bigger than yourself, then people are more apt to be willing to listen to you talk about yourself, right? If you're just telling stories to sound cool or look good, then people turn off. But if you can show that it is connecting to either explaining something complicated in a story format and revealing vulnerabilities, this goes back to being able to reveal vulnerabilities will also help create authenticity, so people are more willing to listen. And then also, if you're able to also connect it to something bigger than something just about you, then that is often received better also.
Colleen asks if you can remind us of the book you mentioned. She thinks it was Redirect.
Redirect. Yep. Timothy Wilson, University of Virginia.
Will that be on the bibliography that you send out?
Yes.
Great. All right. Shelley says thank you. And we hope you'll join us next month once again, October 18th for Got Grit, 11 a.m. Arizona time. Thank you, Dr. Cross.
Thank you, everyone.